Ave Maria, and welcome to Divine Poetry, a series that explores the chronological parallels between the history of the Catholic Church and the Old Testament. If you're new to this concept, go back and watch my interview with Kevin Davis. The link is in the video description below. To make things more simple, I have divided up church history and the Old Testament into 8 color-coded time periods. Below you can see a scrolling bar with the names, dates, and the Old Testament books for each period. Use this timeline to guide you in each video. The color frame of each video will match the time period that we're discussing. Now, let's start today's episode. Hello, and welcome to Episode 5 of Divine Poetry. Today we're going to pick up where we left off, which was the parallels between the books of the Machabees and, in our time, Vatican II and Novus Ordo. I couldn't cover them all in one episode, so we're going to continue on with this episode, and then we'll finish off next Tuesday, with the final parallels to round out the whole series. Before we start, though, I want to announce that the publication date for my book, we're going to set it on Easter Monday. So we're going to distribute on Amazon, but also I would prefer to distribute from my house. So we're going to order a couple hundred copies of the book, and then we can take orders from there. If you want to pre-order, then 2 things. We'll make sure that you get the first round of publications. You'll be able to, because if demand is higher than we think, we'll have to order another batch in, and you might have to wait. So if you want to pre-order, you can get one right away. And also, if you do, I'm going to include a free copy of this brochure timeline that will stuff into the front cover of the book that you can have too. You can't get that on Amazon because there's no way I can insert that into the cover because they ship direct. But if you order from us, then I'll be able to do that. So again, www.machabeanuprising.com. If you go there, you can just sign up real quickly with an email, your name if you want, and then we'll make sure we get you in on the first round of distribution. All right. So today, let's continue on with the parallels between the books of the Machabees and Vatican II and the Novus Ordo. If you remember, a couple things just to kind of refresh your memory. We went over the 4-part division of Alexander the Great's empire and the mirroring or the paralleling of that of post-World War II, the post-World War II world, specifically Germany, and how the Seleucids in the Old Testament were one part of that 4-part division, and they infiltrated the temple, put on the abomination of desolation. And then in our time, the Soviets would be the part that would infiltrate the Vatican, and then through their influences with Paul VI and John the 23rd, who are known to have had communist ties, they instituted the Novus Ordo, which is the parallel, as far as I can tell, with the abomination of desolation. So that's kind of where we are right now. And throughout this episode that I'm going to be presenting right now, keep in mind that the Seleucid Empire, right? They're the Greek Seleucid Empire. They are the primary prefigurement or parallel with the Soviet communists. If you need a refresher on that, just go back and watch last week's episode, and I'll put a link to that in the comments in the description section of this video. Okay, with that in mind, then let's move on to the first set of parallels here I want to identify. So after the Greeks, Antiochus IV, who was the king of the Seleucid Greeks, he came in and he stripped all of the ornaments and beauty out of the temple. So I'm going to read a quote here from the books of the Maccabees. And after Antiochus had ravaged Egypt in the 143rd year, he returned and went up against Israel. And he went up to Jerusalem with a great multitude, and he proudly entered into the sanctuary, and took away the golden altar, and the candlestick of light, and all the vessels thereof, and the table of proposition, and the pouring vessels, and the vials, and the little mortars of gold, and the veil, and the crowns, and the golden ornament that was before the temple, and he broke them all in pieces. And he took the silver and gold, and the precious vessels, and he took the hidden treasures which he found, and when he had taken all away, he departed into his own country. A laundry list of things that he took out of the temple. And then in Vatican II, post-Vatican II, I'll put a picture on the screen of these bare churches. They stripped all the beauty, all the Catholic beauty out of our churches. Not all of them, of course, but in varying degrees from church to church, this is what they did. And I mean, if you can corroborate this, I can't find any online records of this, but I've heard in the last 8 years of of me, since I came out of the Novus Ordo, I heard of things called statue smashing parties. So apparently the modernists who really hated Catholic ornamentation, just because it gave them joy, they took the statues somewhere into the alleyway, I don't know where they did it, and they smashed them. And so I'm just reminded here of a quote from the books of the Maccabees where it says, he broke them all in pieces, referring to Antiochus. Okay, the next one. Women thrust of their own accord into the holy places or into the sanctuaries. Here's the quote from the books of the Maccabees. And women thrust themselves of their own accord into the holy places and brought in all things that were not lawful. The altar also was filled with unlawful things, which were forbidden by the laws. And again, this is experiential on my part, but I'm sure I can find stats on this. But the Novus Ordo made up new roles that were able to be filled by women. You had the lector. So now, if you go to any Novus Ordo church, which I would obviously would never recommend, but you will inevitably see women lectors. And at communion time, the women will all come up from the pews, and they will go up onto the Novus Ordo altar, and then they will distribute communion. So they're called extraordinary ministers. And then, of course, the altar girls, which happened in the 1990s. And I particularly remember the insistence of usually the mothers that their girls could serve on the altar. So here's that idea of thrusting themselves in. I've heard a podcast by Father Chicada from a long time ago. I think it was him, or one of the other 9. I can't remember specifically which one, but they would say that the Novus Ordo parishes are run by women. Now that's not exclusively true. Nonetheless, there's a lot of truth to it. So there's the thrusting of the women into the holy places. Okay, moving on now to the next one here. The selling of sacred vessels or giving them away. And then in conjunction with that, the allegiance to the pagan or the foreign king. So let me start with the books. Well, first let me kind of describe, as a refresher, what's going on. The Greek king, Antiochus, he was the Seleucid king. His army, his kingdom, they occupied and controlled Jerusalem. And then there were these Hellenizing Jews, the Jews who wanted to be like the Greeks. And they would purchase, one in particular, Menelaus, he would purchase his position as high priest, the usurper high priest. He would purchase that from Antiochus. And then in so doing, he had to give his allegiance to Antiochus. If Antiochus commanded something, he would have to do it. With that in mind, let me read these passages here. And this is going to be concerning, I believe, Menelaus. Yes, okay. But he, Menelaus, being recommended to the king, when he had magnified the appearance of his power, got the high priesthood for himself by offering more than Jason by 300 talents of silver. Okay, so having received the king's mandate, so here we have the Menelaus is petitioning for and receiving the king's mandate, Antiochus's mandate. He returned, bringing nothing worthy of the high priesthood, but having the mind of a cruel tyrant and the rage of a savage beast. And then the final verse I'll want to reference. Then Menelaus, supposing that he had found a convenient time, having stolen certain vessels of gold out of the temple, gave them to Andronicus and others he had sold at Tyre and the neighboring cities. So you have an usurper high priest. Menelaus was of Jewish origin, taking a Greek name, petitioning for and receiving the mandate by Antiochus, then coming back and selling or giving away the sacred vessels of the temple. And so here we have Paul VI before the United Nations. And there's 2 quotes I want to read from Paul VI here. The first one is this. I'll put the reference to the date of his speech. I do have that. I can't, out of my head, I can't remember it. As a matter of fact, we have nothing to ask. This is Paul VI talking. Okay? We have nothing to ask, no question to raise. At most, a desire to formulate, a permission to seek, that of being allowed to serve you in the area of competence with disinterestedness, humility, and love. So there he is seeking from the United Nations the permission to be whatever, the usurper fake high priest. Right? Okay, and then quote number 2, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. This is Paul VI talking again. People turn to the United Nations as it were their last hope for peace and harmony. We presume to bring here their tribute of honor and of hope along with our own. So there he is giving the United Nations tribute and honor on behalf of himself and behalf of hapless Catholics around the world. Now, when Paul VI did that, I think it was at that very day that he gave that speech, he also, from what I understand, I'll put the references on the screen if I can find them, he gave the papal ring and his pectoral cross or his cross to the United Nations. So there he is giving away sacred items. And then, of course, also he wanted to sell the papal tiara, which I think he did, and Cardinal Spellman bought it. So there again is the selling of the sacred items as well. So there's the new Menelaus doing the same thing that the old Menelaus did. Okay, now, I don't have my timer on. I wonder how far along I'm going here. Well, I have no idea how far I am in my 20 minutes, so I'm just going to keep on going, hoping I'm hitting the mark. Okay, now it takes us to the story of Eleazar. Now, in response to Antiochus mandating all his pagan Greek practices and outlawing traditional Jewish practices, he outlawed circumcision, he outlawed everything the Jews would do to either fulfill the law or to express their piety and love of God. He outlawed it. And then he would mandate the Greek customs and Greek sacrifices. Okay, so one of the things he wanted the Jews to do was to eat pork, because in the law of Moses, they were not allowed to eat pork. They couldn't have shellfish, and there was other things they couldn't eat because God commanded it. But then to break their adherence to the law, one of the things was you're going to eat this piece of pork. So they had a stage set up, right? There's a long quote here from the books of the Maccabees concerning Eleazar. It's lengthy. I would love to read it, but I mean, you could just probably read it on your own if you're interested. I'm just going to summarize the story because it's so long. Eleazar was an old man or an old priest, I'm not sure which, but they were making people eat pork, and they came to Eleazar, and he said, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to die. It doesn't become my dignity, number one. But number two, I spent my whole life obeying God's laws. I'm not going to just break them now when I'm old. So he was marching over to receive his torture and death at the hands of the Hellenizing Jews. The Hellenizing Jews were the ones who were perpetrating this particular act. And they were old friends of Eleazar. They probably knew him since they were kids, or maybe he babysat them. I don't know. But they felt a little bit bad for him. So they told him, look, we've known you for a long time. How about you just pretend to eat pork? That way you don't have to break God's law. But then we don't look like we're hapless either. So if you just pretend to do that, we're good. And of course, Eleazar very nobly said that he would not even pretend to eat pork. That's undignified. But also, he did not want to provide a bad example to everyone there watching him. Right? So it wasn't good enough for Eleazar for him just personally not to break God's laws. He didn't want to make it look like he was going along with the Hellenizing Jews and breaking God's laws. So even the appearance of it was enough for Eleazar to reject and to receive torture and death, which he received. Okay, so we have now the story of Cardinal Joseph Mazzenti in church history, who's very similar to Eleazar. So let me just go through some key dates in his life. He was made the primate of Hungary after World War II by Pope Pius XII because of his staunch opposition to communism. They made a cardinal in 1946, and at that point he toured the country as the primate and the cardinal in Hungary, and he toured Hungary denouncing communism and alerting the Hungarians to the danger of communism and the danger to their faith and their religion, but also their physical danger. So, of course, in 1948, the communists arrested Cardinal Mazzenti, and then in 1949, he was brought out after 40 days of mind-altering drugs, of Soviet persuasion tactics, I'm sure torture, and some what they would probably do some mind-bending tricks. Cardinal Mazzenti was. He wrote a note before he went into prison, saying to his friend that he gave the note to, that whatever confessions I give afterwards are disregard them, right? Because he knew that the Soviet pressure tactics. So sure enough, in 1949, they brought Cardinal Mazzenti out onto the world stage on a televised show trial that was meant to show the world that Cardinal Mazzenti was going to confess to these outlandish claims of whatever they accused him of. Everyone in the world knew it was a show trial, and he had bruises on his face and everything. So anyway, after he made his forced confession, they sent him to life imprisonment and then in jail. Okay, now in 1956, the Hungarians, they had a brief revolt and a little respite from communism. I forget, it was under Prime Minister Naj, I believe. If I had to, yeah. So anyway, the communists were booted out of Hungary just for a brief time, and in that moment, in that time, Cardinal Mazzenti was able to escape, and he went to the American embassy in Hungary, and there he stayed. And then, okay, now enter Paul VI. Now, Paul VI comes around in 1971, and he persuades Cardinal Mazzenti to leave the American embassy in Hungary, which Cardinal Mazzenti does not want to do. He wants to stay close to his flock, and he wants to show them that he's not going to abandon them. So he resisted Paul VI and said, I'm not going to leave. I don't want to give the impression that I'm fleeing, that I'm weak. I'm staying with my flock. But under obedience, he agreed to leave. He goes to Vienna, and he's going to write his memoirs. He figures that at least I can write my memoirs about what happened, so I can at least tell the world that, number one, I never caved to communism, and I want to be an example to anyone who wants to hear of resistance to communism, right? Especially in these Eastern European countries. So in 1973, he's removed from his position as primate of Hungary by Paul VI. He was requested to resign, and Cardinal Mazzenti refused. He said, I don't want to resign. I give no impressions that I'm quitting the fight. So the Vatican forcibly removed him, and then they issued a crafty statement afterwards, making it seem like he resigned. So then Cardinal Mazzenti responds in his memoirs he explicitly rejected the idea that he resigned, and he stated that the Vatican removed him forcefully, right? So here we have Cardinal Mazzenti doing many of the things that Eleazar did. And let me just kind of recount the parallels here between them. Okay, I'm just going to read from my notes here, excuse me. Okay, Eleazar and Cardinal Mazzenti refused to submit to the evil persecutors until their dying day. They were both aware of their public image and wanted to give a solid example of courage and virtue in the face of great evil. So number one. Number two, they were both given an easy way out of their persecution. Both chose not to accept the easy way out, and they were motivated by the love of God's people and a desire to be a good example for them to follow. And then number three, both Eleazar and Cardinal Mazzenti were betrayed by their own people. And then finally, the Jews asked Eleazar to pretend to eat pork in order to save his life, and he refused to do so. And similarly, Cardinal Mazzenti was tortured and forced to pretend that he committed all these ridiculous crimes at his show trial. Because remember, Eleazar also had a show trial as well. They both had show trials. Okay, and then as soon as he regained control of his mind, he immediately repudiated his confessions that he made during that forced trial. And so, and likewise also, he refused to pretend that he resigned as well. So you have like a double persecution of Cardinal Mazzenti. You have it by the communists, and you also have it by Paul VI in a more political way. And as a capstone to these parallels with Eleazar, I just want to remind you might be aware of this too, but he wrote a book. So Cardinal Mazzenti wrote two books, his memoirs, and maybe some others as well. But he wrote a book called The Mother. And just remember that, because the next parallels we're going to talk about right now are the mother and her 7 sons. All right, those are the two major stories in the books of the Maccabees of heroism and in just choosing to die as a martyr than to capitulate to the apostasy that was being imposed by Antiochus. The mother and her 7 sons, and then Eleazar. All right, now going on to the last one for today, and that is the mother and her 7 sons. So I have 2 quotes to read from the books of the Maccabees here. And I'll just start off with the first one. So bending herself towards him, her son, mocking the cruel tyrant, she said in her own language, "My son, have pity on me, that bore thee 9 months in my womb, and gave thee suck 3 years, and nourished thee, and brought thee up into this age. I beseech thee, my son, look upon heaven and earth, and all that is in them, and consider that God has made them out of nothing, and mankind also, so that thou shalt not fear this tormentor, but being made a worthy partner with thy brethren, receive death, that in that mercy I may receive thee again with thy brethren." So she is just encouraging her final son, the youngest one, to receive death and torture like the other ones, and don't reject God's laws. Like, don't capitulate to the apostasy. And then another quote here. This one actually, this one precedes the other one, so they're out of order, but they're still relevant. Okay, this one here is ready. "But one of them, who was the eldest, said thus, "What would thou ask or learn of us? We are ready to die rather than transgress the laws of God, received from our fathers." Then the king, being angry, commanded frying pans and brazen cauldrons to be made hot, which forthwith being heated, he commanded to cut out the tongue of him that had spoken first, and the skin of his head being drawn off, to chop off also the extremities of his hands and feet, and the rest of his brethren and his mother looking on. And when he was now maimed in all parts, he commanded him, being yet alive, to be brought to the fire and to be fried in a frying pan. And while he was suffering therein long torments, the rest together with the mother exhorted one another to die manfully. That's hard to read. Okay, so now let's move to church history. And again, I want to remind you also just right now that, remember, the Seleucids and the Soviet communists have these parallels. So there's one phenomenon with this prefigurement of church history that maybe I didn't articulate, is that there often seems to be two manifestations or even more of an Old Testament parallel, but in different realms. So, for instance, you're going to have Vatican II and the Novus Ordo paralleling Antiochus and the Seleucids, but also you're going to have the Soviets do the same thing. Because, so remember, Antiochus wanted to be worshipped as a god. That's why he called himself Epiphanes, meaning the Great One. So in the Soviet Union and communist Soviet Union at that time, at the very beginning, you had Stalin, who was very much like an Antiochus. He had his picture. He had a cult of personality that he was later accused of by Khrushchev, and he wanted his image worshipped. He didn't say worship, but he wanted it venerated all over Russia. So we also have, not only what I'm getting to is we don't just have parallels in the Vatican II and subsequent events, but we also have them in communist Russia at the time as well. So that's why we're going to see in this upcoming parallel here with in church history, we'll see that happen. Okay, so in church history, we have, over the last couple hundred years, different Eastern schismatic rites came back to the church. And I have a list of them here. In 1628, the Albanian Greek Catholic Church reunited with the Catholic Church, The Armenian Church reunited in 1742. The Croatian and Serbian in 1611. The Ruthenian Byzantine Church reunited in 1646. And then the Ukrainian Greek in 1595. And so, because these ancient Greek rites, who were schismatic way back after 1054, and some of them even before that, when they came back during these decades and centuries that I just mentioned, the papacy treated them very specially, because the canon law that was developed throughout the centuries was tailored to the Latin rite mostly, but they didn't want these rites, who are much, much smaller, to get absorbed into the Latin rite system, to canon law system or whatever, because they didn't want them to lose their uniqueness in history. I mean, these are very old rites that go back to the 300s, if not earlier. So as a consequence, the papacy treated them like children. They made special attention and special care for them. They were exempt from certain canon laws, and I don't know all the details, but I know that they were given a lot of special attention. Okay, so when the Iron Curtain fell and separated East from West after World War II, you have these Eastern Catholic rites now. They're Catholic, right? You have them on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. And of course, the fury of Stalin was coming upon them. The Soviets wanted to make particular attention to the fact that they denied their allegiance to the papacy. They would let them continue on as long as they apostatized from the Catholic Church. They didn't necessarily have to say they don't believe in God, but there was that allegiance to the papacy that they really wanted to get a hold of, because they knew that if they would break them from Rome, then they could control them much better and manipulate them. So you have these Eastern rites refusing to do this. Here's a list of some certain bishops of these rites who all were martyred in the years of after World War II up until the start of Vatican II. There's 7 of them. Now there are 2 more that died after that, so really the total should be 9. But if you chop off the end date at Vatican II, then you get 7. Okay. Now here I have a quote from an encyclical written by Pope Pius XII in 1945 called Orientalis Omnis Ecclesias. And this was specifically for the Eastern rites. And he knew about their sufferings behind the Iron Curtain that he couldn't stop. Remember, the mother had to watch her sons die. She couldn't stop them. So all she could do was encourage them not to lose the faith, I guess, in the Old Testament. I mean, they didn't have the Catholic faith, but not to lose their adherence to God's laws, not to lose their love of God. And so likewise, in church history, Pope Pius XII was watching these Eastern rites being massacred by the Soviets, and he encouraged them in this encyclical not to abandon their faith, and particularly not to abandon their allegiance to the papacy. So here's the quote here. Lastly, we address all of you, Catholics of the Ruthenian Church. The Ruthenian Church is the Byzantine rite, and I just mentioned that. We share your sorrows and afflictions with a father's heart. We know that grievous snares are being set for your faith. There seems ground for the fear that in the near future still greater hardships shall befall those who refuse to betray their sacred religious allegiance to him, to the Pope. For that reason, we even now exhort you in the Lord, beloved sons, to be terrified by no menaces or injuries, to be moved by no danger of exile or risk even of life, ever to abjure your faith in your fidelity to Mother Church. It's beautiful. And don't forget, remember, I just mentioned that Cardinal Mazzenti around the same time, shortly after, wrote a book called The Mother. And I haven't read that book, but I just wonder if in that book he references the mother and her 7 sons. Okay, so that's all for today. So next Tuesday, we're going to start off with the response to all these sacrileges and abuses committed at the hands of the Greeks. And that would be the Maccabean revolt. So what happened in the hills of Modin is going to parallel what happens in the Alps in a cone. And then we'll see what happens from there. God bless everybody. Glory be to God. Ave Maria.